Well, I might just open in prayer. The wonders of technology. Thank you yet again, Father, that we can meet like this, even though we're miles apart, Lord, all from around the world. Father, we thank you that it's an opportunity to meet with Sondra and with each other. And Lord, we just look forward to everything that she has to share with us about your beloved Israel, our beloved Israel also, Lord. We thank you. We thank you that we are privileged to be counted as friends of Israel. We bless you, Lord. And yes, hand it over to you, Sondra.
Amen. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. We are meeting today on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Now, I know there is an International Holocaust Remembrance Day that was established a few years ago that is in January, and that coincides with the date of the liberation of Auschwitz. But in Israel, we have been marking Holocaust Remembrance Day almost from the beginning of the state, and the date is set kind of. Well, let me kind of explain it a little bit, but it was initially when the state was established, okay, and the Holocaust survivors first started coming into Israel. There was a bit of I don't know how to put it. It was an uncomfortable meeting, okay, between the Jews who had lived in Israel from before the state was established, and had, of course, today that's a minority of Jews in Israel, but at the time, these were the people that were in Israel and had already begun the very difficult work of tilling the land, turning the desert into a fertile area. Of course, then the kibbutz movement was very important. Today, it's a very different kind of movement, but then a lot of the things that the way the kibbutz was established was done in ways that were dealing with very, very difficult situations, very little money, and the need to join forces. And as a result of them going through these hardships, and one of the things that, of course, became particularly important right in the year before actual independence, the end of 1947, the beginning of 1948, Arab terrorism at that point was really moving, gaining ground much more than ever before. The British had no interest in stopping it. And so part of what was going on, and then, of course, the War of Independence, and people that were fighting and took a stand against the Arabs and ended up with a Free State of Israel. For people who were primarily secular, okay, there developed in these sabras, shall we say, a sense of, what is the problem with Jews throughout the ages? They didn't know how to fight. So when the Holocaust survivors first came to Israel, there was, among some of them, first of all, you had the survivors themselves who didn't really know, it was so fresh, they didn't know how to process what they had just gone through. Some of them didn't want to deal with it. They didn't want to talk about it. They were in unbelievable trauma. And some of them, got married, started to have families. For some of them, that was new families. Some of them lost their spouses, children, in Auschwitz, in the Holocaust, and were now starting over. And so there was also, amongst many of the survivors, a hesitancy about bringing the terrible experiences that they had experienced in Europe, bringing into this new land, a sense of let's wipe the slate clean, let's start over. But of course, they themselves were in terrific trauma. So you had, on the one hand, these Holocaust survivors coming to Israel, meeting up with these proud Jews who are standing strong and are saying, look what we did. We defeated the Arabs. 5 Arab countries were surrounding us, and we did it. I don't know how we did it, but with our creativity and our boldness and our bravery, we did it. And then we have the Holocaust survivors, who are this meager remnant out of 6 million Jews who are murdered who are marched into the death camps and into the crematoria. And at that time, you had a sense among some of the Sabras, if only you had stood up and fought. Why didn't you try to, why didn't you try to fight against this? And of course, as the years go on, people came to an understanding that they didn't have an army, they had no weapons, they had no backing of the countries, and there was resistance of a whole different kind, which I'll get to in a second. As a result, there was this one event that a lot of people in Israel clung to as what they would say one shining light that came out of the Holocaust, and that was the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion. The Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion began on Passover, and it was from the beginning clear that it had absolutely no chance. These people who were already half-starved, there had already been thousands and thousands of Jews who had been transported from the Warsaw Ghetto, mainly to Treblinka, who had already met their deaths, and there was this very, very careful and calculated system that the Nazis used to wear these people down, to starve them, to decimate them. Okay, so you're at a point where what's left, these people that they know they have no hope. They're starved, they have no weapons, they have nothing. They're going in through the sewers. They're going through the sewer system, escaping out to the other side of Warsaw, to the part that isn't in the ghetto, trying to connect with the general resistance movement, the Polish underground, with mixed success. For the most part, the Polish underground said, well, we can help you a little bit, but other than that, you're on your own. And I have to say, very, very important for us to remember that Poles were and still are, for the most part, horrible anti-Semites. Okay, but this is what was going on. And yet these people put together Molotov cocktails that they made with rags and some gasoline that they managed to get a hold of, and held the German war machine at bay for a few weeks. After which, of course, they came in and they destroyed the entire ghetto. They burned all the buildings. They captured whoever they could capture. A few people did survive. Most people didn't. The details about the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprising, we know for the most part because there was a man who was very involved in the leadership there. His name was Emanuel Ringelboom, and he kept a diary, and he buried the diary in these different cans, different jars in the ground in Warsaw. They never found all of them, but they found some of them, and that is how they have a lot of the information. And there are a few people who did survive the ghetto, because this was something that the Israeli Sabras, okay, could connect to in a more meaningful way. The date for Holocaust Remembrance Day was set around the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Now, because the actual date of the uprising was during the holiday of Passover, and nobody wanted to mar the holiday of Passover with a Holocaust Remembrance Day, therefore it was moved to a week later, which is where we are today. We have Holocaust Remembrance Day a week after Passover. Over the years, as I said, things changed tremendously. On the one hand, at the beginning and over these last few days, and in conversations I've had with survivors and with second generation friends of mine, my age are the people of the age of the children of Holocaust survivors. So also growing up in Cleveland, I went to a Jewish school. There were about 20 some girls in my class. About a third of them were second generation to Holocaust survivors. So from a very, very young age, both in Cleveland, and so from a very young age, I was exposed to Holocaust survivors, to their stories. And it's actually very interesting because as we see now, looking back, it's been many years already, different Holocaust survivors responded to their experiences in different ways in terms of how much they were willing to tell. There were always survivors who were more willing to tell and survivors that were not, who had repressed it, who felt that the only way that they could deal with it was to try to put it behind us. But even those people who repressed it, of course, end up with terrible, terrible, it affects them and affects the next generation. So, for example, I knew a fellow, Lou Feig. He and his wife were neighbors of ours in Cleveland. And later in his life, he admitted to my parents there wasn't a night that he didn't wake up at night screaming, nightmares, taking him back to what he experienced in Auschwitz. And he was a survivor of Auschwitz, as was his wife. On the other hand, there was a family who lived here, and both of them have since passed away, Miriam and Nathan Lesser. Wonderful, wonderful people. Their son, Menachem, lives here now. He's my age. And I remember their story. Miriam was 6 years old when the war broke out. She was born in 1933, and in September 1939, she was just about to start first grade. And I remember I had an evening in my home a number of years ago. She was among the first of the Holocaust survivors to accompany young people that they would take these trips to Poland. And this is something that's a very important part of the educational system in Israel. And Jews, and today also some Christians, are coming on these trips. Today, for example, on Holocaust Remembrance Day is the March of the Living. This takes place in Poland, and there are young, primarily Jewish people, and a few older as well, representing 25 different countries who will be marching from Auschwitz to Birkenau, following a path of part of what was a death march. And the person who started this whole March of the Living, the idea was, we're going to come back, Jews, to show we survived. We are still living. And so that's going on today as well. But in addition to the March of the Living, which is the huge project that brings young people from all over the world to learn about the Holocaust, to go visit Auschwitz and to see the camps, and to go and visit the various places where Jews lived in Europe, which are today no more. But around the year, there are groups of Jews going primarily from Israel, but also from the United States and Canada and whatever. And already back in the 70s, this was beginning to be developed, where you would have Holocaust survivors, who then, of course, were much younger, and many more of them than there are today. A group like this, a group of young people, would typically have a Holocaust survivor accompanying the group. It was called a witness. And that person would travel with these people and tell the story of their own personal story. It wasn't something you could get from a history book. All these kids, of course, would have prepared for the trip, and they would have been studying the history, and they would have been reading all kinds of documents, etc. But there's nothing like coming with somebody who can say, I was here, and this is what happened to me, and this is what happened to my family. I remember Miriam Lesser coming back from one of these trips and gathering a bunch of neighbors in my living room and telling her story. And first of all, it was very interesting to me because I asked her son, Menachem, did you know all the years what had happened to your parents? And he said his mother always talked about it. And then I asked her, Miriam, I said, was it hard for you to talk about this, both in more recent years when she was telling groups of people and when she was talking to her children? And she said to me, because she was so young when it all started, she was 6 years old in 1939, she was 12 years old when she was liberated, that it wasn't as difficult for her to tell the story. But she said her husband, Nathan, who was a few years older than her, was never able to talk about it because he was a teenager. He lived also in Poland, and he had many, many Polish friends. And all of a sudden, overnight, these are your friends, and you're assuming that these friends are your friends. They don't care if you're Jewish or if you're black or white or green or whatever you may be. And all of a sudden, overnight, he finds out that they don't want to have anything to do with him. They're reporting him to the Nazis. He has to be afraid of all these people. So there's an enormous sense of betrayal that he felt, that I think this is how she explained it to me. Miriam explained to me why her husband was not as able to talk about it. But again, both of them had nightmares. And everybody I know who are children, second generation children of Holocaust survivors, would always talk about the fact that their parents had nightmares and would yell and scream. And as children, they knew this. As children, they knew that there was this black hole that they could not penetrate, whether their parents told them their stories or didn't tell them their stories. It created enormous guilt. It created a sense among some of the second generation of trying to protect their parents and try to protect their parents from the ordinary disappointments that a child feels. A child goes to school, comes home, he's upset because somebody said something nasty to him in the school, in the playground. The most normal kind of thing that a kid is used to coming home and telling their parents. And very often these kids would come home, and again, we're talking about people my age, would not be able to tell their parents. They would feel they don't want to burden their parents. Or on the other hand, they would feel their parents couldn't possibly react to it in a normal way. And there were parents who actually would say to them, and you think that's a problem? Try not eating for 2 weeks, okay? And you had all kinds of people that were absorbing and trying to create a normal life after the Holocaust, but having a very difficult time doing it. In recent years, more and more of the survivors who is left are willing to talk, and more of the second generation are telling their stories or the stories of their parents if their parents are no longer around. And there's much more of an understanding of who these people were. And if I go back to what I said at the beginning, where the whole idea of Holocaust Remembrance Day began in Israel as something that was going to be anchored to the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion, because this was going to be something that everybody in Israel, whether they were Sabras or they were Holocaust survivors, could connect to as this moment of heroism, okay? At the same time, that created a certain discomfort, because did that mean those who did not rebel were worth less? This year, Holocaust Remembrance Day every year there's a particular theme. This year, Holocaust Remembrance Day is 80 years to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that is the theme. But what I found particularly moving in defining the theme, they did not define heroism just in terms of rebellion, physical uprising, as we saw in the Warsaw Ghetto, but any kind of heroism. And people telling stories about heroism that is so that spans the spectrum. For example, people holding on to their dignity, people holding on to a strong moral standard, people holding on to their faith. Last night, on television, I think it was one of the people that was given the honor. Every year they choose 6 Holocaust survivors who light one of the torches. Okay, they have 6 torches in memory of the 6 million. And the people who light these are themselves Holocaust survivors that are chosen for whatever reason, their story, their contribution to Israeli society, whatever. And one of the stories was just so amazing. This woman talks about how she is in the camps with her sister, and the sister, they realized it was Hanukkah. It was the holiday of Hanukkah, and they wanted to light a menorah. Of course, they didn't have a menorah, and they didn't have candles, and they didn't have anything. But her sister managed to find some string, and they set up some string in like little tin things that they found, and they managed to light it every night of Hanukkah. And they were this sister was talking about her sister lit it, and her job was to stand at the window of the barracks to watch, to make sure the Nazis were not coming to check, and if so, of course, they would blow it all out. The amazing courage to do this very small thing, but for them, first of all, it was life-threatening. You wouldn't think it was life-threatening, in order to hold on to a piece of who they were, a piece of their faith, to celebrate a holiday. I heard another story this morning about a woman telling a story of her father, and about how after the war, he was he was escaping, or the war was in the process of being over, but where he was, I guess already the Germans had surrendered or whatever, things had already broken down a bit. And he managed to find a coat which had belonged to a German soldier, and he's walking east and he ends up in Russian territory. The Russians see him and they think that he is a German soldier, so they want to shoot him. And he says, no, don't shoot. I'm a Jew. I survived the camps. I'm a Jew. And they said, well, prove it to us that you're Jewish. And he said, well, I can speak Yiddish. And he spoke a few words of Yiddish. And they said, oh, well, some Germans know Yiddish because it's very similar to German. That's not good enough. And he says, well, tell us your name. So he tells them the full name with the Jewish name and everything. No, you could have made that up. You could have taken someone's identity. So finally, the Russian soldier says to him, do you know Manishtana? Manishtana is, why is this night different? It is a classic prayer that opens up the Seder of Passover. Yes, so can you sing the Manishtana? And he sang the Manishtana. And then he believed he was Jewish. Now, this Russian soldier himself was a Jew. And it turns out that that day, when this encounter happened, that evening was the Passover Seder. And her father didn't even know that. And she says that ever since that time, when he realized when they celebrate the Passover Seder, they celebrate it as not just singing praises to God for liberation of our people from Egypt, but saying it in praises to God for his personal liberation, and his life being saved as a result of him knowing the prayer of the Passover Seder right then on the eve of Passover. So these are just a few stories that I wanted to share with you to give you a sense of, and really at the end of the day, it is all about stories. Just last week, we celebrated Passover. And biblically, the major theme of Passover, not the Passover that took place in Egypt, but the Passover that we're told in Exodus 13, that is passed on to the generations. The Bible already tells us while they're still in Egypt, okay, the children of Israel in Egypt are given the instruction to do the Passover sacrifice and to get ready and to leave Egypt, and they're given and to put blood on the doorposts and all that. These are very specific instructions that are given to the children of Israel while they're in Egypt. But then we have instructions to the children of Israel how they will celebrate Passover for the rest of eternity, okay? And one of the most important themes that you see every time Passover is mentioned is to tell the story to your children, so that the children and generations ever after will know what happened to the children of Israel, how we were enslaved of Egypt. And there's two parts of that story. It's the story of the enslavement, and at the same time, it's the story of the redemption. And indeed, if you look through the Haggadah, the service, the book that has in it the text and the service for the Passover Seder, it is always both. It is the story of how we suffered, the story of the enslavement, and then the story of the redemption, the miracles, the 10 plagues, parting of the Red Sea, and of course, songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. Today, too, when we mark Holocaust Remembrance Day, there's two parts to this telling the story. The first story is how we suffered. And I always say we, because the Nazis were not looking for this or that individual person. They were looking for us as Jews. And if I had a different history, if I had been born at a different time, they would have been killing me. And I would go even more personal than that. My mother was born in 1933 in Hungary. She was born in Budapest, but actually, shortly after her birth, the family moved to Bratislava, which is Czechoslovakia. Then it's very close to Vienna, actually. I don't know I think it might be in Slovakia today, not in the Czech Republic, but it's in one of them. And that's where she was. And then in 1938, she was 5 years old. Her father had been following the rise of Hitler in Germany. Now, don't forget, Germany is not Czechoslovakia. They were living in Czechoslovakia, which, as it was between the wars, between World War I and World War II, Czechoslovakia was one of the best places for a Jew to live. At a time when in the United States, there were all the major universities maintained quotas for exception for admission to universities for Jews. Only a certain number of Jews were allowed to come into university in the democratic country of the United States of America. In Czechoslovakia, Jews were able to study freely in all Czech universities, and in fact made up a very high percentage of the university students in Czechoslovakia at the time. And that was just one example. They were successful in government positions and in all kinds of other professions. So this was the background. And then on the other hand, you're looking and seeing what's going on in Germany, and Hitler rose to power and what's going on. And it was, you know, he's very concerned, and he actually read Mein Kampf. There are a lot of people that didn't read Mein Kampf. And he read it and he says, I believe Hitler. And then he starts saying that Hitler, you know, he's taking over parts of Czechoslovakia. What really concerned him was when he saw local Slovakians marching through the streets of Bratislava wearing the brown shirts uniform, the early Nazi uniform. These were not Germans, because this part of Czechoslovakia was not yet conquered by Germany. These were Slovakians who were identifying with the Nazis, okay? And this of course, was a red light for my grandfather. My grandfather was a very wise man. He was very wealthy, and he was very wealthy, and he had to leave all his money behind. He left with my mother. She was at that time an only child. He left and he went. He went to London, and then after a year and a half in London, managed to get a visa to the United States. He was lucky, but he was also prescient. He tried desperately to convince his family that his father had died years earlier, but his mother, his brothers, his sister, they were all married. They all had children. And he desperately tried to convince them, leave your money behind. It doesn't matter. Just get out of here. Now's the time. And they didn't trust him. They didn't believe him. They thought he was being hysterical. So if you think about it, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here today if my grandfather wouldn't have been so smart, because my grandfather took my mother and they left. His entire family, my grandfather's entire family, brothers, two brothers and their families, sister and their families, all perished. The only people who survived was my grandfather and his immediate family that left, and yet other relatives who left for Israel in the 1930s. These were the only people of the family who survived. So we look at this and we say, you know, there but for the grace of God, you know, and it's so personal. So it wasn't me. I wasn't there. My mother wasn't there. My mother has early memories of what it was like to live in Bratislava, but she had a very good life. You know, yeah, a little bit of insecurity here and there, but at the end of the day, she had a good life. But when you think of what every single one of us as Jews, especially those of us from European descent, what could have happened, it's just amazing. It's just amazing. So that's Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is what we are doing today. And this is what we're remembering. And usually I talk a lot more, but I really felt led to open it up now to you, because I think that the Holocaust is something that today, thank God, more and more people who are not Jewish are aware of and have studied something about. And I, for example, I remember just two quick stories that I will tell you, and then I want to open it up for all of you and hear from you. I remember that there was someone I met, a Christian from Germany, many years ago, who was on one of the tours that I greeted, and she came to me And I hadn't really talked about the Holocaust. We just talked about Jews. And actually, if you think about it, if we talk about the redemption of Passover, for us, the most important redemption is the state of Israel. The miracle of the state of Israel, such how everything turned around. And even though we're beleaguered and we still have enemies and there's anti-Semitism out there, we have an army and we have a country and we can run our own lives. And it's, of course, we rely at the end of the day on God, but we're in such a different place than we were during the Holocaust. And that really is such a miracle. So I remember this woman, a German Christian, who told me with tears in her eyes, she said, my parents couldn't do anything to save Jews because they had a child who was a special needs child. And they were hiding her and they were so worried that the Nazis would get her. And of course, this was one of the other victims of the Holocaust. Germans believed in the purity of the race, and they went and widespread murdered children, adults, anyone who was special needs. And so, she came with this tremendous sense of guilt coming from Germany, and I understood it. But of course, the vast majority of Germans and Poles and Ukrainians and everybody else did not have excuses. Yes, it was dangerous to save Jews, but there were some people who did it, but not enough. And there were so many people, if you think about it, in Austria, for example, when the Germans marched into Austria, hundreds of thousands of Austrians welcomed Hitler and the Nazis and said, welcome, come, you are our brothers, and we're happy to see you. So this is something that I think everybody needs to know about. Another woman came up to me once and told me, until she was an American Christian, and she told me that until she saw the movie Schindler's List, which came out not that many years ago, she knew nothing about the Holocaust. She didn't even know it existed. She didn't know the word. She didn't know that 6 million Jews were destroyed. This was a woman older than me. Okay, I was shocked. So I'd like you to open your mics, of course, one at a time. I would love from here for you, if you have any questions or any comments, but also, when did you find out of the Holocaust, and how or when did the Holocaust meet you in your experiences?
Come on, somebody start off.
I will if you want.
John, yes, please, John.
Yeah, my mother, during the war, my father was in the Royal Navy right through the war. And I remember my mother telling us when we were a little bit older, I was born in 1946. I was part of the victory celebrations. And my mother said that she had a breakdown because they found out during the war years, later on towards the end of the war, they found out about the concentration camps and all that stuff. And that's when, I don't know why my family had this interest in Jewish people, but that's when I first ever heard about the Holocaust.
Wow, well, that's amazing, though, that your mother took that so to heart when she wasn't connected really in any personal way. Wow.
Sondra,
yes.
Diane from Newcastle here.
Yes, Diane.
John, I was one of those baby boomers born in 1946. My dad came home from the war in January. I was born in November. So I'm a real baby boomer like you. But we learned about the Holocaust when we were at high school with history lessons. And it was a very important part of doing our European history. So we've known about it for a long time, and that's here in Australia in the 1960s, early 60s. I was doing history.
Well, I have to say that Melbourne, from what I understand, has the largest number of Holocaust. I mean, perhaps not today anymore because so many have passed on already, but had the largest number of Holocaust survivors in Melbourne outside of Israel. More Holocaust survivors in Melbourne than in New York, for example, even though New York is a much larger Jewish community. So that to me always meant something, because even after the war, Jews were in DP camps for years. And it was very difficult. Of course, anyone who wanted to go to Israel could go to Israel starting in 1948. But a lot of these people were very hesitant about going to Israel because they had gone through so much hardship. They did not have the strength to go to Israel at that time, which was just another place where there was not enough food, tons of war, and some people just couldn't do it. I remember a story. My brother-in-law was born in 1950 in a DP camp in Germany. His parents were both Holocaust survivors, and they were very Zionist, and they wanted to go to Israel. And they put their names on a list to go. This was before the state, and because they had been in the DP camp since 1945. They were there for quite a number of years, and they were going to go to Israel. And at the end, they had some relative, a cousin or whatever, who was also in the DP camp, ended up getting on the boat to go to Israel first. And they said, we'll go ahead and we'll let you know how it is. And they said, okay, we'll join you. And that was how they left it. In the end, they got to Israel. It was in 1948. It was very difficult. There was war. There was not enough food. There wasn't enough housing. People were living in tents. And these people wrote back to my brother-in-law's parents and said, don't come. It is too hard, And so they waited, and they waited until they got a visa for America. And in 51, I think, when my brother-in-law was a baby, they ended up getting a visa to America. So that's why a lot of these people ended up going to Melbourne, or they went to America. But I have to say, Australia, the government of Australia was actually one of the first countries that were willing to accept the Holocaust survivors after the war.
Yeah.
I think
Yes, Lynn.
I too am 1946 and British.
Wow, we need to do a birthday party.
I think we always knew about the war, because it obviously affected so many of our lives, because so many bombs had dropped around us. But I don't think we understood the horrors of the war in the same way. We understood the suffering of our families and the loss of our lives and homes. So I think it was, as a teenager, I always wanted to go and live on a kibbutz in Israel. I never actually got there, but it's only when I actually became a Christian that I really began to understand and read more books about Israel. And Leon, that book,
Exodus. Yes.
Those books, those kind of books. And since then, I've got lots of stories of Holocaust survivors and their stories, and read them. And again, coming with you. And I don't think you took us to Eilit, but it was when you went to Eilit. And I think
Athlete.
Ah, yes, that's it. I'm not very good on pronunciations.
That's okay.
But it was actually, going into that camp, and when the person who took us in said, this is what it was just like for those people living in these camps, and they brought them out of Germany and put them in camps in Israel. The British did. And I actually had the privilege of meeting the captain of the Exodus ship there.
Really?
He was there, and he stopped to talk to us. So that place was a very moving place, and to be recommended that if you can't get to visit those memorials and other places, to go there.
Well, I think I would like to say something about, you mentioned growing up, you really didn't know very much about it. And I think there was a reason, because there was a lot that I would say, unlike Poland and Ukraine and these places where the people were really collaborators with the Germans, the British were valiant in their fight against the Nazis, but they have a little bit of guilt too, because throughout the time before the war, but when it was already, and during the beginning of the war, there was a time, even in countries that Hitler had occupied, that he was perfectly willing to let the Jews leave. He didn't have to murder them. He was perfectly happy to let them go. And in fact, in some cases, for example, one of the first acts of expulsion that he did was in Germany. So you had the Nuremberg laws that severely restricted the rights of the Jews, stripped them of their citizenship, of their jobs, of the ability to go to schools, etc. And around that same time, one of the things that happened were all Jews that were not native of Germany. Germany before World War II was considered a very good place to be. And so you had Jews who were originally from Poland or from Hungary that moved to Germany. And overnight, these people were literally expelled from Germany, and they had no place to go. And there's stories about these people who walking and back to Poland or wherever, and the Polish didn't want them, and people were left in this no man's land between the borders, and some of them starved and died in these places. So that's just one example. But there was a time when all of these Jews had Britain open the gates of Palestine, of the land of Israel, and it would have let these Jews come in. Number one, we would have had all these Jews in Israel, but these Jews would have all been saved. And so this is a responsibility that I believe Britain carries for this terrible chapter in our history. And I don't think the government of Britain has ever acknowledged its responsibility for that.
No.
But it's wonderful to meet
You're
someone like
right.
you, Lynn, who is different, who recognizes, the importance of Israel and Jewish history. And
I think a lot of British people do, and are very, we've had in various towns, they've had meetings and just said how guilty we are. But another thing which I remember is my uncle was a prisoner of war, and he says at the end of the war how it was bitterly cold, and the Germans didn't know what to do with them, and they were just marching them back and forth, and they were stealing the food from the animals when they were at night. And he described watching, going the other way, groups of Jewish people, and he said, and they were worse than us. They had less clothes than us, nothing. So again, that is an early memory. But of course, we didn't have television and so much films in those days. Whereas America did, we didn't have so much television, so you didn't actually see all the films so early on. It was only when the films came out that you started to see more stuff.
Well, one of the reasons we have the film footage of so much was because the Germans were very meticulous. They didn't do anything halfway. And so they recorded things, they recorded people's names, they recorded the names of the people that went on particular transports where they ended up in Auschwitz, they recorded people's names who were the ones that were killed. And so there was a great deal of documentation. But in addition to written records, there was also photographs. They photographed, the Germans themselves photographed the Jews arriving in Auschwitz and the selection, Mengele, etc., and being marched to the death camps and the crematorium. And so much of this was filmed, both film and stills. And so a great many of these kind of pictures that ended up in Yad Vashem, which is the Israeli his Holocaust memorial, were coming from footage that the Germans themselves took, which is insane. Because and another thing that I learned really for the first time last night, when the president of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, spoke, he talked about that they had established, or they were in the process of establishing, a museum of skulls and skeletons of a extinct race. That's what it was called in German. And they set it up in Strasbourg in France. And they selected Jews particularly for this purpose, killed them in horrific ways, cut up their bodies, and put organs and bones and all kinds of things in cases and test tubes. And they found this after the war. And it took quite a long time until they figured out what the story was, because of course no one had survived, but they found records. And then there were a few people who painstakingly went through the records, matched it up with what they knew about these different people, and were able to tell survivors what had actually happened to their loved ones, these people who had gone here. But think about the evil of people to photograph it, to document it, and then to create a museum that was going to advertise this awful crime. And they didn't, it was, think about it, the Museum of Ultimate Evil. That's what I would call it, the Museum of Ultimate Evil that they created about themselves. It's insane.
Actually,
Diane,
I heard a
something?
very revealing comment today. I was watching a documentary on witnesses. Oh, you've gone dark, Sondra. I don't know.
I didn't do anything, but sometimes it just happens.
Yes.
It'll clear up.
But he had witnessed what went on at Treblinka, which was a pure extermination camp. And he said he saw things he said this, even the devil himself couldn't have sought up the atrocities that were being committed in that place. And I just thought that is surely very telling, you know, that he could say that. Yes, it was Anne Frank that did it for me, though, Sondra, just seeing a play on her diary that left me in tears, and have, of course, tracked with it ever since. Hugh Kitson has done a lot of great movies on British actions over the mandate period, Forsaken Promise, and I've forgotten the names of the other ones, but very good. And Lynn, would you know Rosie Ross? Is Lynn still with us, or is she gone? Would you know Rosie Ross?
No, I don't.
Repairing the Breach. She leads groups of British people to Atlit and Cyprus camps, and has done a lot of repenting on behalf of the Brits, for what happened.
I was in England. I was born in 1942 during the war, and I was very much aware that very bad things were going on, you know, in countries nearby. Of course, we were there. My dad was in a very special unit that was like a secret. It was in the Home Guard, but he had a special job to do, to which secrets he never did disclose. It was to do with the ultimate winding up of things, so that, you know, Britain was freed then. But we were very much aware that the Jewish people were not being treated well. And my mother always embedded into us, never speak disparagingly of the Jewish people. She actually had family that had Jewish names, and her mother was a Barnett, so I think that's Jewish. When I met the Barnett family in Derryad in Ireland, I realised there's probably Jewish in our family, although nobody had actually said it that way. Very special people. And I love them. And I've been to Israel a few times, and I've been studying the language through Hebrew University and a number of years now. So it helps open up the scriptures and give you a real understanding of what's there. It's beautiful. I love it. Thank you, Sondra.
Diane, I think you have your hand up there. Did you want to say something?
I do. Yes, thank you, Sondra. Joy mentioned Hugh Kitson, and I know in one of the films, and I think it was The Forsaken Promise, he talked about General Eisenhower being there. I don't know if it was Auschwitz, but at one of the concentration camps. And he said to the soldiers, photograph everything, take movies, take photos. This has to be shown to the rest of the world, because the extent of it. And I think that's where a whole lot of stuff came. But that, of course, was after the war, that we saw after effects of
when
it.
you saw the photographs of the piles of skeletons and that kind of stuff, that was after the war. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But that was all because of Eisenhower and his soldiers. Take us whatever you can, take photos, lots and lots of them.
I think it was, first of all, I think Eisenhower was in Dachau because the Russians were the ones who liberated Auschwitz, and the camps in Poland were all liberated by the Russians. But it was the Americans who liberated, Americans and the British, I think, who liberated Western Europe. Dachau. And at Dachau, I think it was where Eisenhower was. But I think there was one, it could have been Dachau, maybe somewhere else, where they went into the town. Don't forget, every single camp was located in a town.
Yes.
And people say, like, for example, about Auschwitz. Auschwitz today, the Polish name of the town is Auschwitzim. Auschwitz is the German name that the Germans gave to the town, but it was part of this town. And they talk about the stench that was going on around the year from the crematorium. There's no way that they didn't know what was going on there. And I think it was Dachau, one of these camps where the Americans came, they went into the town and they just marched the whole citizenry into the camp and force them to look and see, this is what your people have done, and then force them to clean up and do all kinds of stuff. But it was forcing them to look at it, them, the Germans, that look at it and say, this is who we are, this is what we've done.
Yeah, a lot of Christian
Overall-
churches too, I've heard about when they heard the trains going past, the organist music louder, and they used to sing louder because they could hear the trains going. They knew where they were going, but they didn't want to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Overall, I think we have to say it's still incomprehensible, isn't it? The
100%.
more that I watch documentaries, you cannot understand, except, Sondra, somebody has said anti-Semitism really is because when we think of the Jew, we think of God. It's him they're really targeting when they look at the Jew, isn't it? I had an Israeli lady ask me once, Joy, why do they hate us? And I just found myself saying, without thinking, it's simple, Shula. You have G-O-D stamped on your forehead.
But you know what? I don't think that really answers it. That may answer some. I think that might answer, for example, some of the anti-Israel stuff we see today and the anti-Semitism that's coming out of that. But European anti-Semitism was deeply rooted in the church.
Oh,
And
yes.
these are people who prayed to God, who believed in God. And so they did not see themselves as fighting against God. They saw themselves as fighting against the devil. And they saw the Jews as representing the devil.
Yeah.
And how that happened, I don't know.
Luther. Sorry for any Lutherans in the audience, but Luther had a lot to do with that mentality, that mindset.
Well, I think it went way before Luther as well.
Yes,
it goes back to the very early church.
Yes.
People dated back to Constantine.
Yes. Before that.
Yeah.
Goes back
early
to
church fathers.
goes back to the 2nd century.
So
The great tragedy for the Christian church, because of course the original church was Jewish. Messianic Jews. And the great tragedy was when the number of Gentiles entering the church became greater, there was a split away from the Jewish roots of the church. And that has led to all sorts of problems. It doesn't excuse anything, Sondra, but that's how it works.
Right. Well, I sometimes wonder, I always find it ironic, and I'm reminded of that line in Fiddler on the Roof, which is, if you have not seen that film, you must.
It must. Beautiful film.
It's an amazing film. And actually, the fellow who starred in that film as Tevye, Topol, just passed away a couple of weeks ago. And it's just a brilliant film. But there's one line there. Of course, what's going on in that film is before the Holocaust. It's showing the pogroms and the anti-Semitism, the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe and in Russia. And at some point, he turns to God. He says, "Okay, God, I get it. We're the chosen people. But, maybe sometimes you can choose somebody else." And of course, that's always been the irony. And, for those of us in Judaism who have Black humor, we all have Black humor because you can't survive all this stuff without a bit of Black humor. And what we would say, oh, yeah, right. Everything happens because we're the chosen people, So you have the sense of, well, people are supposed to be jealous of you because you're the chosen people. That means you're privileged. That means you have everything better. But if you look at our history, we certainly didn't have everything better. And, then you have that statement in Isaiah where he talks about the nation of Israel being the light unto the nations. And of course, that is supposed to be the point of our being chosen. Not that we're better than anybody else, but that through the Jewish people, and that's really what happened in a historical way. We received the Bible, the word of God from God, but through us, it was then spread all over the world, and
Absolutely.
Christianity itself grew out of Judaism. Even Islam grew out of Judaism, but they did weird things with it. So that's a whole different story. But they got the idea of a one God. You know, the Arabian Peninsula was very pagan, and so Muhammad comes along and he gets this idea of one God. Well, where did he get it from? You know, he got it from the Jews. And, you know, so on the one hand, you have, yes, there is an influence, there is this light to the nations, but on the other hand, something happens there where anything but the light to the nations, we're in a position where we can't possibly be a light to the nations, because if we are the subject of hate and derision and anti-Semitism, then you very well can't be somebody that people are looking to and say, oh, we'd like to emulate you. But then I have to wonder if I take it as a historical perspective, which is so easy for us to do today, because like, just look at our conversation today. Many of you talked about, you know, when you were born and what your parents did or knew or didn't know, or the nations that you were from and how little awareness there was of the Holocaust and all that sort of thing. And I think that we are in a very unique place where we can say, yes, Jews were downtrodden. The Holocaust was the climax of it all, but so much had been going on against Judaism for centuries before then, particularly in Europe, and not only. And, so on the one hand, you say, well, light to the nations. And then yet, if we look at what's happening today, we have a state of our own, state of Israel, which it really is in many ways a light to the nations. Look, just of all of you, none of you are Jewish, and yet you all love Israel. Why are you loving Israel? You feeling drawn to Israel. It's
God's country. It's God's people.
Exactly. You're seeing this whole thing that God kind of set up of the idea of God bringing his message to the world through Israel and the Jewish people.
And then giving us the scriptures.
Of course.
Yes, amen.
But you're seeing that at a time when I guarantee you, your great grandparents did not see it that way. They didn't.
True.
They didn't. Yeah. And so we have a situation now, perhaps, and this is not going to justify anything or explain anything, but it's very possible that it is that shift from extreme anti-Semitism, the Holocaust and all that draws the attention to the Jewish people and enables, when things start changing and we have a state of Israel and God is more apparent in his protection of us, that people begin to say there's something unique about the Jewish people. With all this that happened against them, they survived. God must have been, and I'm not one of those people that, people say, oh, where was God during the Holocaust? And that's a good question. But the bigger question is, where was humanity during the Holocaust? Okay. So despite the evil of human beings against the Jews all these centuries, yet they still survived. And that's God. And I think that's part of what is enabling people all over the world to take another look and say, no, wait a second. And if you think about replacement theology, okay, why was replacement theology so easily adhered to? Because it made sense. Okay, you could say, oh, look at the Jews, they're downtrodden people. Well, of course, God's replaced them. They're off the stage of history. At some point, with what we see with the establishment of the creative state of Israel, is what forces replacement theology to be questioned for the first time. Wait, if God really is replacing the Jewish people, then how is it that he just allowed the state of Israel to be established and the Jews to come back from the four corners of the earth? So if you take the historical perspective, something's going on here.
Amen.
Does this justify the horrific of anything? No, these are, people did this.
It's not much of a consolation to you, Sondra, but as I see it, the Jews are a living parable. They're God's living parable to the world. They are a special people, and they will be blessed. They will be justified.
Jews, we wouldn't have Messiah.
Yes,
and you see the head
Oh, the spy who came in from the roof.
Did you see that he was a
So
Mossad?
cold.
What is that? What are you reading on Topol? The spy who came in from the roof.
It says he was a Mossad agent, and his links with the embassies in Britain, and how being an actor enabled him to travel to parts other people couldn't go.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Are they serious?
That was in our paper on Saturday. Big article about it, all about it.
Well, I have a feeling that that's something that would never be publicized in Israel, because Israel doesn't expose who its Mossad agents are. But that's very interesting. Very interesting.
Yes. When you talk about books, an excellent book to read is Our Man in Damascus, if you really want
Oh,
to.
yes.
Yes.
Cohen.
Eli
Yeah.
Cohen, that's it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tragic.
Yeah.
And
Janine,
Well, they made a film about it. It's about
Yes.
Eli Cohen, and they made
Yeah.
a film. I think it's on Netflix. I
yeah,
don't
I've
remember
seen,
what it's called, but it might even be
It's
called
called
Eli Cohen,
Spy.
and it's with Salo Baron. What's his name?
Yes, yes.
Salo Baron or something, I think his name is.
Yes.
Whatever.
He's married to an
He's
Australian
usually a
actress.
comic. He's
Yeah.
an actor. He's a Jewish actor, and he's usually a comic role. And here he did an amazing job, in this very serious role. And I recommend it. It's a very good,
Sondra,
story.
going back to what you started on, though, about Holocaust Day, there is a difference between the Jews of Europe and the Jews who came out of the Arab countries. Yeah, they had a different experience to you. And do you think that part of the problems that are going on in Israel at the moment are because of those differences?
No, not with regard to the Holocaust, not at all. They definitely had a different experience. They had some anti-Semitism, and of course it depends where. In Yemen, they had it worse than in, let's say, in Morocco. But most of the Muslim countries, even if for a good part of the time, look, the Jews never had civil rights. They never had equal rights. But they very often had the ability to live their lives and just kind of get on with things. We didn't have pogroms and stuff like that, but there were some pogroms, and particularly once the state of Israel was established or was nearing establishment, there were tremendous pogroms in Egypt, in Morocco, in Iraq, and particularly there's hundreds of Jews were murdered in Iraq in a series of pogroms that took place right around the creation of the state of Israel. And most of the Jews in these places were actually thrown out of the countries once Israel became a state. So they had a very different kind of experience, but at the end of the day, they too came to Israel with their own history. Now, for a long time, there wasn't enough knowledge about the Holocaust so that people of Sephardic descent, North African, etc., Middle Eastern descent, didn't know as much about the Holocaust. But today that has totally changed, and there's tremendous understanding, and there's a lot more education. And I think everybody in Israel, look, I've seen Ethiopian Jews who have gone to Poland and who have felt so identified with this. Well, this certainly wasn't anywhere part of their story. Physically, but as a Jewish people, they're very identified with it. What's going on now is much more a religious secular divide, a right-left divide. I don't see it at all as around, the experiences of the Holocaust. And in fact, one of the things that has come up now, will these protests continue to go on during these very important days? Holocaust Remembrance Day is, we have not seen any protests about that. In fact, both the Prime Minister and the President, when they spoke last night, issued really sincere pleas for unity, that we can have our arguments and we can yell and scream at each other, and all of that is good, but we cannot cross the line to create animosity and to do anything to compromise our unity, especially since, and they both said this, all our enemies out there, I don't remember if it was, I think it was the president who said that, when the Nazis, they didn't care what kind of Jew you were, and our enemies today is the same thing. They don't care what kind of Jew you are. If you're a right-wing Jew or a left-wing Jew or a secular Jew, religious Jew, our enemies don't want any of us in the area. And that's something. Now, one of the issues that is coming up now, and I will wait and see what happens, but I really hope that these demonstrators just shut up, for a day. On Memorial Day next week, the day before Israel Independence Day is Memorial Day for fallen soldiers and terrorist victims. And this is a day it's really considered a very holy day. It's a day that is dedicated to the memory of these brave people who died for the sake of Israel or because they were Jews in the state of Israel. And there's many different ceremonies. And there's been a few people who are left-wing, or for the left-wing, a few, not a lot, a few, who themselves are mourners. You know, they lost their children, their parents, whatever. And there is a protocol for these memorial ceremonies. They take place at the military cemeteries around the country, the main one being in Jerusalem at Mount Herzl. And there is a protocol that at each one of these official ceremonies, there is an official member of the government that comes. It's the prime minister, it's the deputy prime minister, the minister of defense, and any other ministers. In other words, these are sent to represent the government of Israel at these ceremonies. So you have some people who are saying, I don't want any politicians to be at these ceremonies. And that's wrong. And it's just wrong, because these people are not coming because they're right wing or left wing or religious or not religious. They're coming because they represent the country of Israel, the democratically elected government of Israel. And it's not a day to start with your political arguments against this particular government. It's a day, and there was one man who's a very decorated military hero. His name is Avigdor Kahalani.
Oh.
He's a very, very highly ranked officer, and he was just selected to receive a great honor. The eve of Israel Independence Day, 12 people are elected to light one of these torches or candles, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, represents unity as we come together and celebrate the state of Israel. And he was selected to do one, and he put out a really plea. He says, when I go to the cemeteries on Memorial Day, I see my friends who fell in battle. I see these wonderful soldiers. He said, everybody should come to the cemetery. And if you don't know someone personally, go to a grave that no longer has loved ones there and say thank you to these people who, thanks to their sacrifices, we are here today. Leave the politics out of the situation.
Right.
And I really hope that his plea and the plea of others will be.
Good.
That's it. All right.
Well, that's possibly a good
Great.
note to end on, isn't it? Unless anyone
Just-
else.
Just to clarify very quickly, it's Lyndall. The movie that was mentioned is available on Netflix. It's simply called The Spy, and it's an English language film created and directed by Gideon Raff, and it does star Sacha Baron Cohen, who's quite right, is normally a comedian, Noah Emmerich, Hadarat Son-Ratem, and Nassim Lies. So it is available on Netflix, and it's simply called The Spy, just for interest.
Oh, great. Thank you, Linda.
And there's
Diana has put that
very
in
old
chat,
version.
if
I just say,
anyone's looking at chat. Sorry, Lynn.
sorry, I was to say there is a much older version than that one.
Yeah.
That's the one. But have you ever thought how God went before when he started with Theodore Herzl and starting to get all of this, knowing God knows what's going to happen.
Oh, of course.
Start to make overtures to get the land, the homeland for the Jewish people, and to resurrect the language and everything.
It's amazing. It is really amazing when we look at it from that historical, spiritual point of view. It really is. And I would, by the way, reckon somebody here mentioned the effect that Leon Uris's book Exodus had on them. If you have not read the book, it's an old book. I think it was written in the early 60s. I highly recommend reading it. And you could also see it's an old film starring Paul Newman. That is a film that talks about, among other things, it is that passageway from the Holocaust to the creation of the state of Israel. And it is, I think, a very good book and movie if you haven't seen it.
Very good.
Janine, did you want to say anything? Janine is with us from Geelong, and she spends a lot of her time at the Holocaust Museum, don't you, Janine? Helping out?
Yeah, I just went on Sunday. It was, they had a child Holocaust survivor talking about generational trauma. And there was quite a few survivors there, families. So, yeah, I do. And hopefully it's going to open in July. It's all being rebuilt.
Oh, wow.
It's going to be.
And that is in Melbourne?
In Melbourne. It's built in the original spot where the one before it was built. It's 5 stories high.
Wow. So I hope when I next come to Australia, I would love to go see that then. That would be
Yes.
wonderful. That would be
They
wonderful.
have some wonderful events there. Yeah.
Mm.
I'll just put a plug in for the Sydney Jewish Museum too in Darlinghurst. It's absolutely wonderful. Every time you go, there's something different you didn't see before.
Mm. Mm.
And they're building another one too in Sydney.
Sydney. Mm.
I think there's
No,
something
they're-
being built in Canberra. Is that true? Someone, I think, told me about something being built in Canberra.
The Queensland Premier actually announced quite some time ago now that they are looking at building a Holocaust museum here in Brisbane. It will take quite some time to pull together and curate, obviously, but the idea of capturing memories and so forth from Holocaust survivors who've come to Brisbane is a very interesting one. The last figures that I heard, which are reasonably old now, but wouldn't be that much different, was that there were about 200 Jewish families here in Brisbane. So not a huge community at all, but the idea of us here as the capital city of Queensland having a museum in years to come is an interesting one. So
Mm.
something to keep
Ooh.
eyes and ears open for.
Great, great.
Mm. Mm.
Concerning Canberra, I'm from Canberra. I'm not very in touch with the Jewish community, but I think the Jewish Community Center has had received $5 million from the
Right.
federal government to build a Holocaust museum.
Right,
I don't
right. That's
think
what I had
it's-
heard. Right.
Yeah.
I was there when I was in Canberra. I was there just in September. And when I was visiting the Jewish community, that is what they told me. Right. But
Yeah.
it hasn't started yet.
Yeah, but the
Mhm.
community center has been remodeled, renewed.
Yes.
It's very beautiful.
Yes, it really
Mm.
is. But this is going to be like a whole separate wing or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to be huge.
Mm.
All right, we have gone over, but
Lots.
Very,
Yeah.
very good.
Obviously,
Really
just
enjoyed
got
it.
the time wrong.
Thank you so much.
yeah, all very
Yes.
appreciative,
Thank you
Sondra,
very
and we'll
much.
see you next month again.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
May. We will send out
Okey dokey.
reminders. And if you
Thank
know of people that you think might be interested, then, send them a reminder, ask them to be in touch with us or,
Yes.
sign up, whatever. Let us know if we can help you
Yes.
get them signed up. That would be great.
Yes, okie dokie.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye,
very
everybody.
good.
Thank you.
Bless you
God
all.
bless.
Thank you,
Shalom,
John.
shalom.
So much.
Bye now. Bye.
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 I hope you enjoyed that film. And we have lots more film content and emails and articles that I'm sure you will enjoy as well. Check out our website at cfoic.com and subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that right from the homepage. I know you will really enjoy the content that will land in your inbox on a regular basis. Hope to see you soon.